Victoria adjusted the worn-out strap of her bag on her shoulder and glanced down at little James, his tiny fingers clutching hers tightly. She didn't want to bring him to work, but she had no choice. The babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and missing a shift wasn't an option. If she lost this job, how would she pay rent? How would she put food on the table? The glass doors of Henderson Enterprises slid open, and Victoria felt the overwhelming weight of the place. Everything was polished, pristine, dripping with wealth. People in tailored suits rushed past her without a glance, as if she didn't exist. To them, she was invisible, just the cleaning lady who scrubbed the floors they walked on without a second thought. "James, sweetheart, you have to be a good boy today, okay?" she whispered, kneeling to smooth his soft blonde curls. He smiled up at her, eyes bright with innocence. She started her shift on the 20th floor, scrubbing spotless windows and mopping the cold marble floors. James sat quietly, playing with his plastic toy. Everything seemed under control until, in the blink of an eye, it wasn't. James was gone. The mop slipped from her fingers as her pulse skyrocketed. "James," she whispered frantically, scanning the hallway. Where was he? He was only 2. Her breath hitched as she took off running, panic tightening around her chest like a vice. Then she heard it. "Daddy!" The tiny voice echoed through the hushed executive floor. Victoria froze. The world around her blurred, sound faded, and for a moment, all she could feel was pure shock. Her legs trembled as her gaze slowly shifted toward the office where the voice had come from. Inside, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, was Maxwell Henderson, the most powerful man in the building. Tall, impeccably dressed, always composed. But right now he looked pale, stunned. His piercing blue eyes locked onto James with a mix of confusion and something deeper, something dangerously close to recognition. "What did he just call me?" Maxwell's voice was low, sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. His gaze flickered between James and Victoria, searching for an answer. Victoria's stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at her to grab her son and run, but her feet wouldn't move. "Mr. Henderson, he's just confused," she stammered, pulling James protectively into her arms. But Maxwell didn't look away. His expression darkened as he studied the boy, as if trying to see beyond the obvious. There was something there, something he couldn't ignore. A suffocating silence followed. Then Maxwell stood up. Slowly, he rounded the desk, taking a step forward, his eyes never leaving James. "Is this some kind of joke?" His voice was unreadable, but there was no amusement in it, just disbelief and fear. Victoria swallowed hard. "No, sir, I swear it's not. James is just a baby. He doesn't understand what he's saying," she said, her voice shaky. But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her own mind. Maxwell narrowed his eyes, and then, for a fleeting second, something shifted in his expression. He looked at James again, longer this time, taking in every detail. The fair skin, the bright blue eyes, the soft features. And then Victoria saw it. The realization, because James hadn't just called him Daddy, he looked like him. "Wait," Maxwell commanded, his voice now firm, unyielding. Victoria clutched James tighter, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to leave, now, before this got any worse. But Maxwell took another step forward, and in that moment Victoria knew. Everything was about to change. And this is just the beginning. What will Maxwell do next? Don't miss out. Hit the like button and subscribe to follow every moment of the story. Victoria's breath hitched as Maxwell took another step forward. His sharp blue eyes locked onto her like a predator cornering its prey. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. James, still cradled in her arms, wiggled excitedly, completely unaware of the tension suffocating the room. His tiny hand reached toward Maxwell again, as if drawn to him by an invisible force. "Daddy," he repeated, his voice full of innocent joy. Maxwell flinched, just slightly, but Victoria saw it, the brief flicker of something in his expression. Doubt? Recognition? She couldn't tell, but it sent a chill down her spine. Why did he call me that? His voice was low, measured, but there was something unsteady beneath it, something unraveling. He wasn't just asking a question. He was demanding an answer. Victoria swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Mr. Henderson, please, he's just a baby. Sometimes kids say things without knowing what they mean. I promise, it's nothing. Don't lie to me, Maxwell interrupted, his tone like steel, sharp and cutting. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted to run, to escape this moment before it spiraled further out of control. But Maxwell wasn't letting her go that easily. There's something you're not telling me. His gaze dropped to James again, scanning his features, his soft blonde hair, his bright blue eyes, so much like his own. His expression darkened. Victoria felt a lump rise in her throat. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. For 2 years, she had kept her life carefully separated from the past she was trying to forget. She had built a fragile existence where secrets remained buried. But now, standing in front of the one man she never wanted to face again, she realized the truth was clawing its way to the surface, whether she was ready or not. I need to get back to work, she mumbled, shifting James in her arms, moving toward the door. But before she could take another step, Maxwell's voice stopped her dead in her tracks. Victoria. It was the first time he had said her name. Not Miss Taylor, not the cleaning staff, just Victoria. And the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. There was something raw in his voice, something almost desperate. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned back to face him. Maxwell exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. Tell me the truth, he said again, quieter this time, but no less demanding. His eyes flickered between her and James, and for the first time, the carefully controlled facade of Maxwell Henderson cracked. Victoria's lips parted, her breath unsteady. She wanted to lie. She wanted to walk away. But as James rested his tiny head against her shoulder, as Maxwell's gaze bore into hers with a mix of suspicion and something dangerously close to hope, she felt the walls she had built for years start to crumble. I can't, she whispered. Victoria could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs as Maxwell took another slow step forward. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers like a hawk closing in on its prey. The tension in the room was suffocating, wrapping around her throat like an iron grip. She could see it in his face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. He wasn't just angry. He was searching for something, some kind of truth that he already suspected but refused to believe. You can't or you won't? His voice was quieter this time, but there was a sharp edge to it, a controlled intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just asking, he was demanding, and the way his eyes flickered toward James, still cradled in her arms, made her stomach twist into knots. Victoria's grip on her son tightened, as if she could somehow shield him from what was happening. She took a slow breath, trying to steady her shaking voice. Mr. Henderson, please. He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying, she said, the words feeling weak even as they left her lips. It wasn't the real answer, and she knew Maxwell could hear that. Don't lie to me. The words came sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Victoria flinched, her breath hitching in her throat. She wanted to run, to turn around and walk out that door like this never happened. But she couldn't, because Maxwell wasn't backing down. His eyes were locked onto James now, his expression dark and unreadable. He was putting the pieces together, slowly, methodically, and with every passing second, she could feel the walls closing in around her. Maxwell exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw as if trying to ground himself. If there's even the slightest chance that this child is mine, he said, his voice lower now, almost dangerous, then I deserve to know. His eyes flickered back to Victoria, and for the first time, she saw something in them that sent a fresh wave of panic through her. It wasn't just anger, it was hurt. Victoria's throat tightened. For 2 years, she had convinced herself that keeping James a secret was the right thing to do, that Maxwell had no place in their lives, that she was protecting her son from a world he didn't belong to. But now, standing here, facing the one man she had tried so hard to forget, she felt her carefully constructed reality crumbling at her feet. "I need to go," she whispered, shifting James slightly in her arms. She turned toward the door, desperation clawing at her chest. If she didn't leave now, she would break. But before she could reach the handle, Maxwell's voice stopped her cold. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Victoria felt her breath catch, her pulse roaring in her ears. Slowly, painfully, she turned back to face him. His expression had changed. His usual cold, unreadable mask was cracking. And beneath it, she saw something raw, something she never expected to see in him: pain. Her lips trembled, and for the first time since stepping into that office, she stopped fighting, stopped running, because there was only one truth now, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, there was no hiding from it anymore. "No, I didn't." Maxwell's entire body went still, but Victoria could see the shift in his eyes. The way his breathing slowed, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. He didn't explode in anger, didn't shout or demand explanations like she expected. Instead, his silence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. Her words had done something to him. "No, I didn't," and now she couldn't take them back. The truth was out, sitting between them like a loaded gun. "You were never going to tell me," he finally said, but his voice wasn't as sharp this time. It was lower, rougher, as if the realization had punched the air from his lungs. Victoria could handle his rage. She could handle his accusations. But this quiet devastation, it made something twist painfully in her chest. She shifted James in her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body pressed against hers. "I did what I had to do," she murmured, though the words felt weak even as she said them. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself, because the truth was, she had spent the last 2 years terrified of this moment. The moment Maxwell would look at their son and see himself. Maxwell let out a breath, slow and controlled, but his hands were clenched at his sides. "Why?" The question was quiet, but it sliced through her defenses like a knife. Not how had this happened, not when, just why. And somehow that hurt more. Victoria swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Because I didn't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was scared. Because I had nothing and no one, and you were Maxwell Henderson." The name itself felt heavy on her tongue. "You had your life, your company, your world, and I was just a girl who didn't belong in it." His jaw tensed, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression she wasn't prepared for: pain. "You thought I wouldn't care?" His voice was rough now, strained with something dangerously close to betrayal. "That I would have just walked away?" Victoria let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You wouldn't have had to," she whispered. "Your life was already moving forward, Maxwell. You had plans, a future. You were building an empire. What was I supposed to do? Show up at your office and say, 'Hey, surprise, I'm pregnant?' You would have seen it as a burden, problem to fix." Maxwell's eyes darkened, something unreadable flashing behind them. "Is that what you think?" His voice was dangerously quiet now. "That I would have seen him as a problem?" Victoria's throat tightened as she looked down at James. His tiny fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt. Her everything. "No," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "James isn't a mistake. He's the best thing that ever happened to me." Maxwell inhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as if trying to process everything at once. But when he looked at her again, something was different. The cold detachment he had always carried was gone, and in its place there was determination. "Then I should have known about him," he said, each word deliberate, unwavering. "And now that I do," he took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can't expect me to walk away," and just like that, Victoria felt her world tilt beneath her feet, because she saw it in his eyes the moment Maxwell Henderson made a decision. He wasn't letting this go, and she wasn't ready for what that meant. Victoria's pulse pounded in her ears as Maxwell's words sank deep into her chest, wrapping around her like an iron chain. You can't expect me to walk away. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a decision, one she had no power to undo. And that terrified her more than anything. Maxwell Henderson was a man who never backed down, never let something slip through his fingers once he had a grasp on it. And now he knew the truth. Her fingers curled tightly around James, holding him closer as if she could shield him from the storm brewing between her and Maxwell. "Maxwell, please," she whispered, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "This isn't as simple as you think." She didn't know what else to say. How could she explain 2 years of fear, of long nights spent questioning herself, of the suffocating doubt that had convinced her to stay silent? Maxwell's eyes flashed with something dark, something unreadable. "It's not simple because you made it that way," he shot back, his voice low, controlled. But there was a sharp edge of restraint, like he was holding himself together by a thread. "You had 2 years to tell me, Victoria. 2 damn years." He took a deep breath, but it didn't seem to steady him. "Do you have any idea what you took from me?" The weight of his words slammed into her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, wanted to fight back. But the truth was, a part of her did know. She had spent every single day of James' life wondering if she had done the right thing, if she had been fair to the man standing in front of her. But what was she supposed to say now? "Sorry, I was scared? Would that make a difference?" "I did what I thought was best," she said finally, though even to her own ears it sounded weak. "You have a life, Maxwell. A name, a reputation. James and we don't fit into that world." His jaw tightened, his blue eyes narrowing. "That wasn't your choice to make." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The way he said it, low and steady, yet filled with something raw, sent an uncomfortable shiver through her. She had braced herself for anger, for accusations, maybe even threats. But what she hadn't prepared for was the pain in his voice. "What would you have done?" she asked, her voice quieter now, hesitant. "If I had shown up 2 years ago and told you I was pregnant, what would you have really done, Maxwell?" For the first time, Maxwell didn't have an immediate answer. His lips parted slightly, his eyes flickering with something vulnerable. Uncertainty. That was what shook her the most. Because Maxwell Henderson was always sure, always in control. And now, standing in front of her, he wasn't. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough, uneven. His hands settled on his hips as he let out a slow exhale. "But I should have had the chance to figure it out." The truth of that statement cut through Victoria like a blade. Because he was right. No matter how much she wanted to justify her choices, she had taken that chance away from him. And now, she could see the weight of that realization in his face. "You don't get to just show up now and decide you want to be his father," she whispered, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her chest ached. "It doesn't work like that." Maxwell stepped forward, closing the space between them, his presence suffocating. His voice dropped lower, firmer. "Watch me." And in that moment, Victoria knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. What should Victoria do now? Do you think Maxwell has the right to be in James' life? Or is it too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. Victoria could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her heart hammering against her ribs as Maxwell's words settled into the air between them like an inescapable force. "I can't. And I won't." There was no room for negotiation, no sign of hesitation in his voice. He wasn't just speaking, he was staking his claim. And that realization sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent 2 years preparing herself for the day James might ask about his father, for the moment when she'd have to decide how much truth to give him. But she had never prepared for this, for Maxwell Henderson standing in front of her, looking at their son like he had just lost and found himself at the same time. Her arms tightened around James instinctively, as if holding him close would somehow keep Maxwell from getting any closer. "Maxwell," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you don't understand what you're saying." His jaw tightened, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. "No, Victoria, you don't understand," he shot back. "I didn't ask for this to happen. I didn't expect it. But I won't stand here and let you tell me I don't have a right to my own son. Victoria felt her breath hitch at the sheer force behind his words. I can't just what? Maxwell interrupted, his voice lowering but no less intense. Pretend I don't know? Pretend I don't see myself every time I look at him. His gaze dropped to James, still resting against Victoria's shoulder, his tiny hands gripping her shirt. When he looked back up, something in his face had changed. You made this choice for me, Victoria. You took away my right to know him. But that stops now. Panic flared in her chest, cold and consuming. She shook her head, forcing herself to stay calm, to think. You don't get to walk in here and rewrite the past, she said, her voice sharper now. James doesn't know you, Maxwell. He's just a baby. He's never... And whose fault is that? Maxwell snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Victoria sucked in a breath, her body stiffening. I did what I thought was best, she whispered, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. Maxwell let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair as if trying to keep himself from losing it. And what gave you the right to decide that for both of us? He asked, his tone lower now, but no less demanding. What gave you the right to look at our son, my son, and decide I didn't deserve to know him? Tears burned behind Victoria's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I was protecting him, she said, her voice cracking under the weight of those words. From me? Maxwell asked, his brows furrowing. Do you really think I would have hurt him? She shook her head quickly. No, it's not like that. She swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. Your world, Maxwell. It's not ours. I didn't want him to grow up as some obligation to a man who never wanted this life. Maxwell flinched, just slightly, but she saw it. And for the first time, he didn't have a quick response. Victoria took a shaky breath and stepped toward the door. Please just let us go, she whispered. But before she could take another step, Maxwell's voice stopped her cold. I won't, he said simply. I lost 2 years of his life, Victoria. I won't lose any more. And as Victoria looked into his eyes, she realized something that sent a wave of fear crashing over her. Maxwell wasn't going to let them go. Victoria's breath came shallow as Maxwell's words settled over her like an inescapable force. I lost 2 years of his life. I won't lose any more. There was no anger in his voice now, no shouting, just quiet, unshakable determination. And that scared her more than anything. She had prepared for the possibility of Maxwell finding out one day, but she had convinced herself that, if it ever happened, he would walk away, that he would see the life she had built for James and understand that they were better off without him. She had never expected this for Maxwell to fight. James stirred slightly in her arms, his tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her shirt. His innocent face was peaceful, unaware of the battle raging just inches away. He doesn't know him, Victoria reminded herself. Maxwell is just a stranger to him. And strangers didn't just get to walk into their lives and claim a place. You don't get to do this, she finally said, forcing her voice to remain steady even though her hands were trembling. You don't get to just decide, out of nowhere, that you want to be a father. Maxwell exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing. You act like I had a choice, he shot back. Like I knew and walked away. But I didn't. And now that I do, you think I can just forget it? Pretend he doesn't exist. His voice was controlled, but beneath it, there was something else. Something raw. Victoria clenched her jaw, every muscle in her body tightening. He's not some missing puzzle piece in your life, Maxwell, she said, her tone sharp. He's a little boy. He needs stability. He needs someone who's been there since day one. Not someone who suddenly decides they're ready for the responsibility. Maxwell's eyes flashed with something dark, something unreadable. And what if I am? Victoria's breath caught. She wasn't expecting that. She had expected anger, frustration, not this quiet conviction. She searched his face for doubt, for hesitation. But there was none. He wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. Victoria, he continued, his voice lower now, calmer, I don't want to take him from you. But I can't just walk away either. I need to know him. I need him to know me. Her throat tightened. This was exactly what she had feared. Not that Maxwell would reject James, but that he wouldn't. That he would see the child they had created and refuse to let go. And then what? What happened when Maxwell realized that being a father wasn't something he could fit neatly into his already perfectly curated life? You don't understand what you're asking, she whispered, shaking her head. You don't know what it means to be there for him, to wake up every night when he cries, to hold him when he's sick, She exhaled sharply. You don't know what it's like to love him the way I do. Something shifted in Maxwell's face. A flicker of pain gone as quickly as it came. But Victoria saw it. You think I won't love him? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard. I think you don't know how. The silence between them was deafening. Maxwell's hands curled into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid. And then he took a slow, measured step forward. Then teach me, he said. Victoria's stomach twisted. It was the last thing she had expected him to say, and the one thing she didn't have an answer for. Victoria's breath was shallow, her mind racing as she tried to process what Maxwell had just said. Then teach me. The words lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable. Maxwell Henderson, a man who had built his life around control, success, and power, was now standing in front of her, asking her to show him how to be a father. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, the way he looked at her, unshaken, unwavering, made her stomach twist. You don't understand, she whispered, shaking her head as she adjusted James in her arms. You think this is something you can just decide? Something you can just learn like it's another business venture? She scoffed, though there was no humor in it. Being a father isn't about showing up when it's convenient for you, Maxwell. It's about waking up every night when he cries. It's about knowing what calms him down when he's scared. It's about being there. Not just when it fits into your schedule. Maxwell didn't blink. Then let me be there. His words sent a chill through her, not because they were unexpected, but because of how easily he said them. Like he truly believed he could just step into this role and make it work. You don't just get to show up now and play dad because you feel guilty, she bit out, the anger and fear bubbling to the surface. Where was this determination 2 years ago? Where were you when I was alone? When I had no idea what I was doing? Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. She hated that, even now, part of her wanted to believe him. Maxwell exhaled slowly, as if trying to hold something back. I didn't know, Victoria, he said, his voice lower now, rougher. I can't change the past, but I can decide what happens now. He took a slow step forward. And I'm telling you, I'm not walking away from him. She felt the room closing in, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had spent 2 years convincing herself that this moment would never come, that Maxwell's world and hers would never collide again. And yet, here they were. Maxwell, she shook her head, her throat tight. You don't even know what you're asking. What happens when you realize that being a father isn't something you can just control? When it doesn't go the way you want? His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Then I figure it out. Victoria let out a sharp, humorless laugh. And what if James gets attached? What if you step into his life and then one day decide it's too much? That you don't have time? What happens when your business comes first, like it always has? Maxwell's expression darkened slightly, and for the first time, she saw it, the flicker of uncertainty. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. That won't happen. How do you know that? She challenged, her heart pounding. Because I won't let it, he said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Victoria stared at him, searching for any hesitation, any crack in his confidence. But there was none. Maxwell Henderson wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. She exhaled shakily, pressing James closer to her chest. And what if I say no? Maxwell held her gaze, his eyes unreadable. Then, in a voice calm but unwavering, he said, Then I'll fight for him. Her stomach dropped. She had been waiting for this moment, for the moment Maxwell would show her exactly what kind of man he was. And now she had her answer. He wasn't going to let them go. Victoria's breath hitched as Maxwell's words settled over her like a final, inescapable verdict. Then I'll fight for him. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the weight of his presence suffocating. She had spent 2 years convincing herself that this moment would never come, that she had successfully built a life where Maxwell Henderson no longer existed. But now, standing in front of her, his jaw set, his eyes unwavering, she realized something terrifying. He wasn't bluffing. "You don't mean that," she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew she was wrong. Maxwell took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "I don't say things I don't mean, Victoria." His gaze flickered to James, who was still nestled against her, oblivious to the storm raging around him. When he looked back at her, something in his expression softened, but it didn't lessen the force of his words. "I lost 2 years. I won't lose any more." Victoria felt her pulse spike. "You think you can just take him from me?" Her voice was quieter now, but filled with something sharp, something dangerous. Maxwell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to contain his frustration. "That's not what I'm saying. I don't want to take him from you, Victoria, but I won't be a stranger in his life. And if you try to keep him from me," he paused, his voice dropping lower, more controlled. "I will do whatever it takes." A shiver ran through her. She knew what those words meant. He had power. He had resources. And if he decided to use them against her, she didn't stand a chance. "You'd really do that?" she asked, her throat tight. "You'd drag me into a courtroom? Put James through that? Just to prove a point?" His jaw clenched. "It's not about proving a point," he said firmly. "It's about being his father." Victoria's hands trembled as she adjusted James in her arms, her mind racing. She had spent every day of the last 2 years protecting her son, making sure he was safe. And now, in one conversation, everything she had built felt like it was slipping through her fingers. "You don't even know him," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't know what his favorite bedtime story is, or how he refuses to sleep without his stuffed elephant. You don't know that he's scared of thunderstorms, or that he laughs every time he sees a puppy on TV. You don't know anything about him, Maxwell." His face tightened, but he didn't look away. "Then let me learn." Victoria's breath hitched. It was the second time he had said those words, "Let me learn." And a part of her, the part she had buried deep down, wanted to believe him. But belief wasn't enough. She shook her head. "And what happens when it's not convenient for you anymore? When your company, your perfect life, your responsibilities come first? Do you just disappear? Leave him waiting for a father who never shows up?" Maxwell's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his gaze, something close to guilt. "I won't do that to him." "But how do I know that?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "Because right now, all I see is a man who wants something because he just found out it exists." "But what happens when the novelty wears off, Maxwell? What happens when being a father isn't new anymore?" The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since this conversation started, Maxwell had no answer. Victoria felt her stomach drop. That silence told her everything. She turned toward the door, gripping the handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "If you really want to be in James' life," she said, barely above a whisper, "you'll have to prove it." Then, without another word, she walked out, leaving Maxwell standing alone in the silence. But as she stepped into the hallway, her heart pounded with the terrifying realization that this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Victoria's fingers trembled as she turned the doorknob and stepped into her apartment, James resting against her shoulder. The world around her felt like a blur, and the weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. Her little boy, peaceful and unaware, breathed softly in her arms. He had no idea his life was about to change forever. She shut the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, trying to catch her breath. But her mind wouldn't stop racing. Maxwell's voice still echoed in her head, every word filled with promises and unspoken threats. He wanted to be part of James' life, and he wasn't going to give up. She walked to the couch and sat down, holding James a little tighter, as if that alone could protect him from what was coming. Fear crawled under her skin. What if Maxwell was right? What if she had made a mistake keeping him away? She had spent 2 years convincing herself that she was protecting her son, that Maxwell would never belong in their world. But now he was fighting to prove her wrong. The doorbell rang. Victoria froze. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, her body torn between opening the door and pretending she wasn't home. But deep down, she already knew who was standing on the other side. Taking a shaky breath, she got up and opened the door. Maxwell stood there. There was no arrogance in his posture, none of the ruthless CEO persona she had come to know. Instead, there was something different in his eyes: determination, exhaustion, and something she never expected to see in Maxwell Henderson: vulnerability. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. Victoria hesitated for a second before stepping aside. Maxwell closed the door behind him and stood still, his eyes fixed on James, still asleep in her arms. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything left unsaid. "I'm not going anywhere, Victoria," Maxwell finally said, his voice breaking through the tension. "I know you're scared. I know you don't trust me, but I want to be here. I want to do this right." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what if you can't? What if, one day, you realize this isn't your world?" Maxwell exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before looking directly at her. "Then let me prove it to you." To him, Victoria felt her throat tighten. Everything inside her screamed to protect James, to keep control over the life she had built. But looking at Maxwell now, she saw something she hadn't expected: honesty. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. Then slowly she nodded. Maxwell didn't move, but she saw the emotion in his face, the quiet relief. He knew this wasn't full acceptance. This was a test, a beginning. Victoria looked down at James, his little face calm and innocent. Then she looked back at Maxwell. "If you ever let him down," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I will never forgive you." Maxwell held her gaze, his expression serious. "I won't." And for the first time, Victoria let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. Maybe Maxwell Henderson was capable of loving their son. And maybe, deep down, she was ready to let him try. What would you do in Victoria's place? Does Maxwell deserve a chance? Or is it too late? Comment below. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.